homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Welcome back, young friends and everyone joining for this gradual teaching series. We are continuing to look at the Buddha's gradual instructions on the blessing of renunciation. And today we're looking at how the Buddha fulfilled the higher perfection of renunciation as the Bodhisatta. So we're looking at some of the former births of the Buddha. So one of the things to know is that as a Bodhisatta, this is someone who is destined to become a future Buddha, and they usually aspire to an enlightenment in the future. So this is the designation that we call Prince Siddhartha before his enlightenment and also in his former births. So when he's practicing as a Bodhisatta, there are certain higher perfections or practices that need to be fulfilled. And we know this in Pali, it's called parami. So paramis are translated as perfections, completeness, the highest state, principal virtues. And so we can easily call it the 10 higher perfections. So in Pali that's dasa paramiyo. So if we go to the Buddha Vangsa, which is in the minor discourses, this is all about the Buddhas. And the second chapter of the Buddha Vangsa is called the Sumedha Patana Katha. And in this particular chapter, Venerable Sariputta asked the Buddha, what kind of resolution did he have to make? When did he aspire to the supreme enlightenment? So he had all these questions, and one of them was, what were your 10 perfections? And how were the higher perfections fulfilled? And so the Buddha goes on to explain these 10 higher perfections. So the first one is the perfection of giving, dana parami. The second is the perfection of virtue, sila parami. The third, which is what we're going to focus on today, is the perfection of renunciation, nekkhamma parami. And then the fourth is the perfection of wisdom, panya parami. The perfection of energy, virya parami is number 5. 6 is the perfection of patience or endurance, which is kanti parami. The 7th is perfection of truth, satya parami. The 8th is perfection of determination or resolution. This is adhitthana parami. The 9th is perfection of loving kindness, metta parami. And the 10th is perfection of equanimity, upekkha parami. When you read the Jaatika stories, which are all the stories about the former births, you find all the different things that the Bodhisatta is training towards, practicing towards in terms of these higher perfections. So when we look at what the Bodhisatta had to do in terms of fulfilling the higher perfection of renunciation, there are certain former births that are quite interesting for us to look at. And when we look at the giving up, the renouncing of the world, we see that it's not just what happened as Prince Siddhartha, but it's really a culmination, a whole process of training and perfecting that the Bodhisatta had to go through. And what we'll see is some of these stories are really quite remarkable. And when you understand the depth of the renunciation, how many kingdoms that the Bodhisatta gave up, how many things that had to be foregone in order to practice as an ascetic, then it's quite remarkable and you understand how Prince Siddhartha actually did it. When we look at the Jātikas, these former births of the Buddha, what we normally find is when the Buddha comes across the monks talking about his great renunciation, he normally says to them, this is not the first time that the Tathagata has made the great renunciation. He's done the same before. What we learn from a number of Jātika stories, and on this particular slide there's only 4 that we're going through quite briefly, goes through a particular process where he's born and he decides to renounce or give up. And it's a big giving up because most of the time what we'll see is he gives up royal palaces, the royal life, the power, the prestige, the sensual pleasures that come with royal life. So the first Jātika we can go through is called the Ayogara Jaatika. This is Jātika number 510. And in this particular Jātika, we find out that the Bodhisatta was once a prince. And he was born to the king and queen, who had some difficulty because the first two children that were born to the queen, they were eaten by a goblin. When they had their third child, the king wanted to keep the child safe. And so he built this iron house and determined that once the prince was born, that he would keep him safe by locking him up in this iron house. And he wouldn't be able to come out for fear that the goblin would come and try and take him and eat him. The prince was called Prince Ayogara Kumara, and he stayed in the iron house from the time of his birth until the age of 16. And we find out that the goblin passed away through some kind of means, and so he was safe from the goblin. So the king prepared all kinds of festivities, and he was allowed to leave the iron house. So when Prince Ayogara was able to come out and go in a chariot and tour around the city, he realizes how beautiful the world is, because all he's seen is inside of the iron house, literally a prison for him. But at the same time, he realizes that despite leaving firstly his mother's womb and then being able to leave eventually this iron house, he realizes that he cannot escape aging and death. And so he's not interested in the royal life. He wants to renunciate the world for the spiritual life. And so that's what he eventually does. And his parents, what we learn from the Buddha later on, is that they are actually his parents in the present life. They are the ones who also follow him, and eventually the whole kingdom follows him as well. They renunciate the world. And what happens is they all become a lot wiser and eventually ascend upwards. The next example we can look at is the Udanchaya Jaatika. So this is Jaatika number 460. And the Bodhisatta, again, he was born as a prince. And this time he was first born and named Crown Prince Udanchaya. So one morning he went out in his chariot and he was with an entourage, and he saw dew for the first time. So dew are like water drops very early in the morning. What he learned was that dew evaporates as the sun rises. So he saw that and he had an insight. He realized life is also impermanent, just like those dewdrops. And so he returns to the royal palace and he asks his parents for permission to renounce the world, to become an ascetic. He sees palace life, royal life as futile, that it doesn't make any sense to him. So he'd rather pursue the life that is the spiritual life. And his parents try to convince him not to go. They try to entice him, but eventually they have to give their permission. And so he departs the kingdom and takes his younger brother with him, who is Prince Yudhishthira. And the Buddha says that this was actually Ananda in a former birth. And so again, they practice and ascend upwards. So that's the second example. Again, renouncing much power, much prestige, and many sensual pleasures. So the third one we can look at is Hattipala Jaatika. This is Jaatika number 509. And once again, the Bodhisatta is born into the palace, this time as the royal chaplain's eldest son, Hattipala. And he, through an agreement between the royal chaplain and the king did not have any children, they determined that Hattipala would inherit the kingdom at the appropriate time. Before he was born, it was foretold that him and his three brothers, that all four of them would renunciate the world. The king and the royal chaplain, they both decided to do everything that they could to prevent that from happening. So they removed all the ascetics who lived in the kingdom. They got them to move out of the kingdom. So these four sons would never come across anybody who would be an ascetic, never get that idea. However, when Hattipala came of age, the king and the royal chaplain came and tried to persuade him and endow him with the umbrella that would deem him about to become the next monarch. But as they were conversing, Hattipala decided that he wanted to renounce the kingdom, to embrace the spiritual life as an ascetic. There was nothing in the kingdom that enticed him, and on his own accord he wanted to follow the spiritual life. He left the kingdom and he waited nearby, knowing that eventually others would follow him. And one by one, his three brothers, they renounced whatever was being offered to them to inherit the kingdom and to rule. Each one of them went to follow Hatipala. So eventually, his entire family, which included the king, the royal chaplain, their wives, the people in the royal palace, all the people in the kingdom, eventually all went to follow Hatipala. Even more than that, kings came and saw that the kingdom, there was no one there, and they inquired and they realized they'd all gone to Hatipala. So they too also went and visited, and they too decided to renounce the world. So in the end, there were several kings and hundreds of thousands of people that were also following him and wanting to join the spiritual life. And so at the end of the Jataka, we learned that Hatipala was the Bodhisatta, of course. Anuruddha, Moggallana, and Sariputta, venerables, they were the three brothers. The parents of Hatipala were his parents in this particular lifetime, Prince Siddhartha, Gautama's parents, so King Suddhodana and Queen Mahamaya. So again, that is a massive renunciation that the Buddha did as the Bodhisatta. The fourth one is the Mugapaka Jaatika, and this is Jataka number 9. Again, we have this incredible story where the Bodhisatta was once a king, and he ruled very righteously, very morally for a period of 84,000 years. So this was a time where the lifespan was very long. And in the latter years, this king Mugapaka, he asked his barber to let him know if he found any grey hairs. So the barber eventually found a single grey hair, and King Mugapaka was greatly shaken with the realization of his own foolishness that he hadn't attended to developing the spiritual life. The grey hair was a trigger for that, realizing that there was aging, and with aging there is death. And so he decided on the very same day to renounce the world for the spiritual life. He rewarded his barber, gave him a sum of money, and he called his son, his eldest son, to come, and he passed the kingdom to his eldest son. And then he took up abode in the mango grove to lead the ascetic life. And so he was quite fortunate in terms of his practice. Then he was reborn into the Brahma world. And there's more to that story, but that's probably more than enough. You can see in these 4 examples from the Jatakas how much renunciation was done by the Bodhisatta. And if you look at the culmination of it, you can see how each time, each instance, there's a perfection that is accumulated because you keep giving up more and more and more. And so by the time Prince Siddhartha was born, he had perfected being able to give up so much of the world. We're now going to take a bit of an extended look at the Mugapaka Jaatika, and this is number 538. The monks again were discussing and praising the Blessed One's great renunciation, and the Buddha comes along and he asks them, what are they discussing? And when he finds out that they're discussing about his great renunciation, he says to them, "No, bhikkhus, my renunciation of the world after leaving my kingdom was not wonderful, when I had fully exercised the perfections," so the paramis. "For before, even when my wisdom was still immature, and while I was still attaining the perfections, I left my kingdom and renounced the world." The reason that the Buddha says this is because when he gave up in previous or former births, he was still training to perfect these higher perfections. When he did that with a lesser kind of wisdom, it's a greater renunciation in many ways, because by the time he became Prince Siddhartha, he had already perfected the perfection of renunciation. And so in his own way, he's saying to the monks, look at the accumulation, the training that I did, what I gave up in previous births in order to then have it all culminate in becoming Prince Siddhartha and then giving it all up again for the final thing which leads to perfect enlightenment and in order to save so many others as a Buddha. So this story about Prince Temi is a very interesting one. And it's very interesting because he was born to a king, the king of Kasi, who ruled Benares. This particular king had 16,000 wives, but his chief wife was Chandadevi, and they were trying to have a son so that they could keep up the line and pass down the kingdom to their son. and they were having difficulty. But the chief queen, Chandadevi, she was very much into charitable works, and she observed the BODHISATTA. So the whole kingdom was praying for a son. And Sakka, king of the Devas, decided to grant the wish because of the virtue of Queen Chandadevi. At the time it was offered because the Bodhisatta was born into, I believe, the Tavatimsa realm. And he knew that if he came down to the human realm, he could train in these perfections. So the Bodhisatta was born, and it was seen as very, very auspicious. So he had the auspicious marks, and it was foretold that he would have a very good life and that there would be no dangers for him. And so he was given the name Temya Kumaro. Now, when he was 1 month old, he was sitting on his father's lap, and his father was doing what kings would normally do, which is to hear the troubles of the kingdom. And on this occasion, there were 4 robbers that came to be judged by the king. And eventually, after hearing the case, the king passed judgment on the 4 robbers, and the judgments were: 1 would be whipped, another would be imprisoned in chains, a third would be hit with a spear, and the 4th would be impaled. So very horrible sentences. Prince Temya, even at that age, he was terrified after hearing what his father had given as the sentence. And he recognized the unskillfulness of his father's actions as the king. He knew that these were very much unwholesome things that he was sentencing. So the next day, his fear was still present, and at that time he recollected his former births. Prince Temya realized that he had come from the Deva realms, where he lived for a long time, and then subsequently he suffered in the hell realms for 80,000 years. And so he recognized that if he was going to become king, and he would have to pass these sentences and have this kind of cruel actions and unwholesome speech, then again he would be reborn after that time in the hell realm again, and he would suffer greatly. So as he lay there thinking about it, he was very concerned about what he could do to escape the predicament. And a Deva came along and tried to comfort him. What we learn is that in a previous birth this was his mother. So this Deva advised him not to fear, that if he really wished to escape, then he had to pretend to be crippled. He had to be pretending to be deaf and also to be dumb, to be mute. And he must also pretend that he had no intelligence. When Prince Temya heard this advice, he decided to make a determination, a resolution of sorts, to actually follow that advice, to appear deaf, dumb, and crippled, and to show no intelligence. So when the prince started to appear in that particular way, the king and the queen and the royal courtiers, they were very surprised because he didn't have the signs, like his body wasn't appearing like a crippled person, and nothing before had shown them that he was deaf or dumb. So they tried everything to help him to overcome any weaknesses or to heal him in many ways. And all that time, Prince Temya, throughout whatever they determined to do, he kept counseling himself that whatever he had to endure, whatever they were trying to test him with, it was better than what he endured when he was tortured in hell for those 80,000 years. So the first thing that they tried was around feeding him milk. He determined not to cry for milk even though he was thirsty or hungry. So he had to endure the thirst and the hunger for many different types of intervals while they tried all sorts of different things in order to get him to behave like a normal child. But he didn't shake. He kept persisting and not responding. The second thing that they tried to do was to tempt him with cakes. So as he got older, they tried to tempt him with cakes, but he wouldn't even look at them. And then the next thing they tried to tempt him with was fruit, because they thought, oh, all children like fruit. But again, he wouldn't look at them. And then the next thing they tried was toys, like playthings. And again, he wouldn't look at those things and he would definitely not pick them up. All that while he was still thinking, if I shake, if I respond to any of these things, then all of this is over. I would be expected to take up the kingdom and be trained for it. And so he decided to continue to persist and be resolute in not responding. When he was 4 years old, they decided to tempt him with different kinds of foods, thinking that he would respond to it. And again, he thought about the fact that in the lower realms, he had to endure times where there wasn't any food. And so if he could just persist now, then it would still be better than what he endured in the hell realms. And so the king and the queen and the royal household, they were very perplexed because they thought he still had no signs of being crippled or deaf or dumb. And so what was going on? So they kept trying to test him. When he was 5 years old, they tried to scare him with fire, but he stayed motionless. He stayed very still, and he didn't scream, which is what they expected. They couldn't shake him. And then when he was 6 years old, they let loose a well-trained elephant. They expected him to be scared, but instead he allowed the elephant to lift him up and put him down, and the elephant didn't end up hurting him, and yet he still didn't respond. And they kept imploring him to come out of whatever state he was in. So when he turned 7 years old, they tried something else. They tried to use snakes or serpents. Again, Prince Themia, he remained motionless. He thought it's better to die by these snakes, by being bitten or hurt by these snakes, than to suffer all those years in the hell realms. So then the other things they tried is they tried to have all the young boys of the kingdom come together around his age and have performances and hope that he would respond, but he just ignored it all. And then they tried scaring them with someone coming with a knife and threatening the crowd. And the man even went up to Prince Themia and put the sword on the top of his head and threatened to cut his head off. But again, he didn't respond. And then they tried to disturb him with lamps that were lit, put under his bed, so the bed would heat up and eventually he would get sores on his body. Even having to endure all that pain, he didn't respond. So eventually they tried something else. They had this other idea that they would smear his body with molasses, which is like a thick kind of honey. And of course, when you do that, it attracts a lot of flies and insects. And so he was bitten and in great deal of pain when these flies attacked his body. And still he did not respond. And then when he was 14 years old, they decided not to bathe him and clean him. Even after he went to the toilet and all the different types of things, they wouldn't even let him rinse his mouth. And then he was ridiculed for being so unclean and to smell and everything. Eventually, all these different things, he didn't move, he didn't shake, he remained motionless. Just after so many years, they begged him, saying, "You're not crippled, you can't be deaf and dumb. Come out of whatever difficulty you're going through." But he just ignored them. He kept counseling himself that if he breaks now, then he would come to this very bad existence of having to rule the kingdom and then be bound for the hell realm again. And so he decided to ignore them, to continue with that. When he was 16 years old, they decided to try a different tack. And they invited some young, beautiful women to try to entice him and seduce him. And they bathed him and prepared him. And then these young women, they danced and they sang and they said very nice things to him, trying to tempt him. But he kept himself very, very still, didn't move, and his body was almost like a statue. And so they couldn't shake him or make him waver. They couldn't entice him and make him interested. So by the age of 16 years old, they tried so many different great tests and also many smaller tests as well. And they couldn't detect any weakness in Prince Themia, any weak point in him. And so eventually the king summoned his fortune tellers and he asked for advice about what to do. They actually said to him that the prince was now a threat to him and to the kingdom, and that they needed to send him away, take him away by a chariot and go and bury him in a cemetery or a charnel ground. And the queen, of course, pled for her son's life and requested a boon from the king, like a favor, saying, "Please give me this." What the queen requested was for Prince Themia to be given the sovereignty for 7 days. And so for at least 5 days, if not 6 days, he was paraded and then given the position of power. But he was still behaving in the same way, as if he was crippled, as if he was deaf, and as if he was mute. And so she begged him and begged him and begged him, saying that his life was about to be taken and that he was about to be buried, that this was such a misfortune. And when Prince Themia heard this, he was relieved. He thought to himself, at long last, these 16 years of enduring all these different tests it would now reach an end. And so he determined, in a way, perfecting the adhitthana parami, which is the perfection of resolution. He resolved to stay deaf, to stay mute, or pretend to be, and to pretend to be crippled. Because he thought, if he gives in now, then everything that he'd done to this point would have been fruitless. But if he stayed in this way, then he could save himself and he could save the king and the queen and potentially the kingdom. So on the 7th day, the charioteer who'd been given the order to take him away and bury him, he came, and the queen was with Prince Themia, and she was pushed away and she was broken-hearted. As the Bodhisatta, Prince Themia determined, it's still better for me to leave. If I speak now, all will be lost. So the charioteer lifted him up and took him away. What we learn is that the charioteer leaves the city and goes quite a distance and comes to a forest which appears like a charnel ground. So he thinks it's a suitable place. So he stops, alights, and he takes all the ornaments that belong to Prince Themia, and then he takes a spade and he starts to dig a hole. At this moment, Prince Themia, the Bodhisatta, he says, "This is my time for effort." For 16 years he's never moved his hands or feet, and he wonders whether there's any power in them. So he rises up and he rubs his right hand with his left, and his left hand with his right, and his feet, he rubs them with both hands, and then he makes another resolution to alight from the chariot. So when his foot comes down, it's like the earth comes up to meet his foot, and when he alights, he begins to walk backwards and forwards several times, and he feels as if he has strength to walk a very long way. And so he reflects on what the charioteer is about to do. And so he contemplates, will I have the power to overcome what the charioteer is about to do? So to test his strength, he seizes hold of one end of the chariot and lifts it up as if it were just a toy. And so he realizes he does have the power to contend with the charioteer. And so what happens is, Sakka, king of the Devas, sees what is happening. He perceives it from the Deva realm, and he realizes that Prince Themia, the Bodhisatta, has attained some of the perfection that he was striving for. And so he sees that Prince Themia's desire is to take the ascetic vows. It is at this point that Prince Themia reveals himself. He reveals himself that he is not deaf, he's not dumb, and he's not crippled. And so he has this dialogue with the charioteer, and the charioteer actually wants to stay with him when he realizes the vows that the Bodhisatta wants to take, that he wants to leave behind the kingdom. And of course he doesn't want to be buried in the charnel ground. In the end, Prince Themia sends the charioteer back to the kingdom. He wants it to be known what has happened to him, that he is in fact someone who wants to lead the spiritual life. And when the king and the queen hear of this, they immediately want to find their son. They want to beseech him, knowing that he's been pretending the whole way through, that he's actually very wise, that they want him to come back and rule the kingdom. They immediately come and find him, and they realize that after a while that he teaches them. He teaches them what he knows, and he teaches them about the fleetingness of living this life and the trouble that comes when you do unwholesome things. So the king decides to give up his kingdom, and so does the queen. And eventually the entire kingdom decides to renunciate. So the kingdom comes to follow Prince Themia, who now becomes Mugapaka the wise. And they all ordain by taking the ascetic vows under Mugapaka the wise. And it also comes to be that other kings come to visit, and they realize that there's no one there. And so they wonder, what's happened here? What's happened to this particular kingdom? Why isn't there anybody here? And so other kings eventually find their way to Mugapaka the wise, the Bodhisatta, and they realize how fortunate they are to have found such a wise teacher. So this teacher is able to teach them about many different Dhammas. And also what we learn is that eventually the ones that come to follow him, and I think it's about 3 different kings, as well as his own parents and his own kingdom, they all essentially ascend upwards. So what we learn from this is really about the Bodhisatta training, and we learn about the training in the higher perfections. So you realize that all along the way, although the renunciation is something that's very great in this story, but there are other things that is being perfected. The perfection of wisdom, the perfection of determination, so many different things like that. And so we learn so much from hearing the stories about the Buddha's former births. Really the most wonderful thing is we can't truly fathom the enormity of the great renunciation, that we can't fathom how much it took. We hear these stories and it still seems so far away, but if we can get a sense of even the slightest piece of how much Prince Temia had to give up, to not shake, to not fall for it, knowing what he knew, then it's truly incredible. It's really inspiring. And it's something that we can be very grateful for. So when we learn about Prince Siddhartha and what he gave up, that is already incredible. But when we hear all these different stories of former births, and each time a kingdom was given up, power was given up, sensual pleasures were given up, happiness was given up, all these different things, then we start to feel inspiration for the little bit that we need to start giving up as we train, as we start to understand the importance, the blessing of renunciation. And it's incredibly humbling, because if we can recognize that it's very difficult for us to give up, say for example, our time, if we admit and acknowledge that it's very difficult for us to give up money, to give to others, if we acknowledge that it's very difficult to give up our comforts or to live a more simple life rather than what everybody else is doing, which is to have a more lavish life. When we have greater wisdom, we start to understand the importance of renunciation, the importance of giving up and not going with just what we want. So when we start to connect with that, we realize that this little glimpse that we get about renunciation, how very important it is. And that's what it's really about, that we start to see in all these former births of the Buddha, he really did have right view. He really saw the fleetingness of life. He saw what happens with aging, sickness and death. And he understood that it's important to forgo something, to understand what this is really about. And when we go on to the next module of this gradual teaching series, what we learn is really the crux of the Buddha's teaching, which is the Four Noble Truths. And to know the way out of dukkha is the fourth noble truth, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so that's what we're going to look at in our next module. But one of the key things when we listen to these wise words from the Jātikas, these former births of the Buddha, is right view begins with understanding karma and rebirth. And we've looked at this. We've looked at this as we've talked about giving. We've looked at this as we've talked about virtuous behavior, about the heavenly realms, about the danger in sensual pleasures, and of course in this blessing of renunciation. Now when we reflect on Prince Temia and his ability to see his past lives, it's even stronger for him, because he knew that he fell from the Deva realms after he fulfilled his lifespan in the Deva realm. He fell to the hell realms for 80,000 years, and he suffered greatly. And so when you know that he didn't want to rule as a king. This is the most amazing thing. If you ask anyone in modern times if they want to be a king or a prince or a princess or a queen, most people would say yes. But from this Mugapaka Jaatika and this story of Prince Temia, he really didn't want to be king. He didn't want to grow up and take that power, prestige, wealth, all the trappings that come with being the king. And most people in today's world would say they would want it because it's seen as such a wonderful lifestyle. But the wisdom of Prince Temia is that he knew the danger of it. When he listened to his father and he saw how much akusala, how much unwholesome things in delivering a sentence, passing judgment, he thought, this will only send me to the hell realms again. And so that's right view. That's what we're going to talk about in our next module. This is the thing about all these different stories. They're always teaching us. They're always teaching us how to walk this path correctly. And so there's a huge amount of encouragement here and a huge amount of inspiration. And we can feel very humbled, very grateful for what the Buddha has done. All this was done in order for us to receive these teachings, to have trust in the Buddha. If he did not do this level of renunciation, we would find it very difficult to trust him. And all these other higher perfections, if he didn't perfect all of them, all the different ones, it would be very difficult for us to trust him. But because he has perfected these, then all these things come together, and he is the perfectly enlightened one. And so we can trust in his teachings, and when we practice them, we realize them for ourselves because we see it in our meditation, in how we develop, how our virtue develops, how our concentration develops, how our wisdom develops. This is the proof in the pudding. So with the blessing of renunciation, what's truly amazing is how many people he saved, even as the Bodhisatta. We know that Devas, they really respect the Buddha, they venerate him. We should do that also and take this teaching as a gateway to, again, understanding the importance of renunciation, the importance of enabling the escape from the dangers of the world, the dangers of unwholesome behavior. We've now come to the end of our session. We can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem, wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.